Hi everyone! Hey, how you doing? It's me. Welcome back to my channel. I am Sean, and today I'm going to be reviewing The Return of the Indian by Lynne Reid Banks. So, a little backstory. As a kid, I loved the film The Indian in the Cupboard. It was one of my favorite movies. I binged watched it all the time. So, about 3, 4 years ago, I was at the library and I saw The Indian in the Cupboard, the book, and I wasn't even really aware that there was a book, I think. So I saw it at the library and I was like, ooh, there's a book. I'm gotta read it so I can compare it with the movie. Anyway, I read the book, The Indian in the Cupboard, and I liked it pretty well. But one day I was whatever. I was walking through the local bookstore and I saw this book, The Key to the Indian by Lynne Reid Banks, and I saw there's a sticker on it it's signed. So I thought, ooh, the author of Indian in the Cupboard, a signed book by her. And I think this is the 5th book in the series, and I think it's actually the final book in the series. So I got that about a year ago. But I still remembered liking the first book, so I was kind of open to reading the second book anyway. And a few months ago, I was at the bookstore and I saw The Return of the Indian, and I was like, oh, that's book 2, I need to get that. And then I pulled it out and I saw there's a signed sticker on it as well. I've had this book for a few months, but I wanted to give it a read because I did enjoy the first book, so I was really curious to read it because I had no clue really what could happen. It was really interesting that for the first book I'd seen the movie, but for this one, since there was no movie, I believe, I did not know anything what to expect. So it was like a whole fresh adventure, and that was really exciting to me. So I had pretty high hopes for it. So like I've said, this is the second book in the Indian in the Cupboard series. I do think you should read the first book first, for sure. So it's not a book where you could just really pick any book in the series and start there. You should read them in order. So this book is set, I think, about a year after the events of the first book. Omri wrote a story about the Indian in the Cupboard, which wins a contest. So because of that, he wants to bring Little Bear back and tell him, hey, I wrote this story about you and it won a contest. Yay! So he begins to think about bringing the Indian back after a year. But for some reason or another, he needs to get Patrick involved. And you'd know this alone is a recipe for disaster because Patrick has a way of causing problems. And of course, problems ensue. So the first red flag in the book, Omri, the main character, the boy from the first book, he wrote, apparently, a story about the Indian in the Cupboard, and he submitted it to a writing contest. That is a red flag because just for me personally, I do not like books where it's very blatantly autobiographical, basically. So Lynne Reid Banks wrote this book, The Indian in the Cupboard, and it was a phenomenal success, I guess. So in the book, Omri wrote this story about this Indian in the cupboard, and it is successful and it wins this contest. So obviously it's just kind of based on Lynne Reid Banks writing about herself, writing about the Indian in the cupboard. And I just don't like that. And there's several books that have things like this. Like in The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. I think it says that Amy Tan in her biography says something like she was a magazine writer or something. It says something very specific about something like that. And in the book, there's a character who's basically the exact same thing. And I just don't like things like this in books where like a real life magazine writer becomes a novelist and writes a novel about a magazine writer who becomes a novelist. Or a book about a real life rap singer who writes a novel about a rap singer who writes a novel. Or whatever. I just don't like these kind of very blatantly obvious autobiographical books. It's just not creative to me, and it's just obvious that the person is just writing about themselves. And I don't really like that for some reason. I do know this is just a pet peeve, But it does kind of bother me, and I can't really say why. I just don't like it too much. But there was actually another red flag even before that. In the very start of the book, in the introduction, Lynne Reid Banks talks about how she is grateful for children sending her letters of ideas for the next book. That is a red flag because in Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Baum. He wrote in several of the books how he was grateful to children for writing and giving him all these story suggestions and everything. And I think that is bad because children are terrible as story suggestions because they just cannot really think anything through. They have ridiculous ideas and it doesn't really make sense. And I just don't like it because I think The Wizard of Oz was a good story, but L. Frank Baum, I think, tried to incorporate all these ideas that children were sending him, and it was just a mess. And so I think Lynne Reid Banks may have done the same. All these children send her ideas, and so she's like, okay, well, I guess I could try that, and I guess I could try that, without really thinking it through. So I think, as a general rule, do not take story advice or story tips or story suggestions from children. I know some people would really disagree with that. Maybe there are some books where brilliant ideas from children. But on the whole, I think it just creates problems, and I think it's a recipe for disaster, as I think you will see in this book. The next thing that really bothered me was it was really apparent that Patrick once again was going to be causing problems. And I really just hated him in the first book. I didn't remember hating him so much from the film when I was reading the book, but when I read the book I was like, oh yeah, I remembered I kind of disliked Patrick a little bit in the movie, but it was really clear in the book, like, this, just do not hang around with his kid. He just causes problems. And here again in the second book, Patrick is back and he's causing problems again. I don't know why Omri puts up with this kid, but at a certain point, you've just got to think the problem is with Omri here, because he just cannot tell Patrick to just get out and leave him alone and just never hang out with him again because he causes problems. But he sticks with him and he lets Patrick cause all these problems. And that, I think, is kind of annoying, but it's not really something I would dock that book a star for. But what did bother me is some of the logical decisions later on in the book. And this is where it goes into the bit about the children sending ideas. This is where I think children may have said, oh, why don't you do this? And Lynne Reid Banks was like, I could do that, without really thinking it through. And so because of it, there's a lot of plot holes and inconsistencies. So this section will kind of be spoiler-y, so if you don't want to hear any of those, go ahead and skip to the next chapter. So, spoiler warning. When Little Bear is brought back through the cupboard, he is injured. He was in a battle against the French. They were attacking his village, and so he was shocked, and so Patrick and Omri need to find some way to get him healed. So this is what begins the chain of events that lead to the crisis, basically, because they're bringing all these characters and more problems ensue. And meanwhile, Little Bear is wanting to go back because he wants to defend his village. He wants to defend his tribe from this attack. So Little Bear begins thinking, well, just give me some reinforcements. Give me some Indians and give me, quote, now guns from the modern era, and we'll go back and we'll beat this invading army. So Patrick and Omri are, of course, like, oh yeah, this sounds like a good idea. Nothing can go wrong with that. So in the end, what they wind up doing is they use modern soldiers, they bring them back, they get their guns and equipment and artillery and everything from them. They take that from them, and then they give that to all these Indian toys, and they're very careful in selecting the right kind of Indians because they want to make sure that the Indians that they bring back would help Little Bear, that they wouldn't be against him. And so to go back in time, apparently what they do is they all link up with Little Bear, and that sends them all back together. This is the first problem, because how does the cupboard or the key, whatever the magical bit is, how does the magical mumbo jumbo know which person to send back to which timeline? So if you have like 25 Indians all holding hands or whatever, how do they know to go back to Little Bear's timeline, and only Little Bear's timeline, at this exact moment of this battle? Why wouldn't they go back to any timeline from any random one of them? That does not really make sense. But it gets deeper flawed than that. Patrick and Omri, as if they don't cause enough problems, think, hey, why don't we go back ourselves? But the cupboard is too small, so they use this chest, reasoning that it's not the cupboard that's magical, it's the key. So they try it out. Patrick goes into this chest. They use the key, which conveniently fits the chest, and he leaves them in there for a few seconds and then opens it up, and Patrick reports that, oh my gosh, I went back in time. But for some reason he went back as some inanimate object. I forget what. But anyway, Omri does it too. He goes back, and Omri, I think, becomes the TP, because I think he had the TP in his pocket or something. So he goes back and he's actually a part of that. He's not his actual person. And this again opens up plot holes, because apparently in the next book, Patrick uses the chest to go back to Boone's time, but he goes back as a person. So I don't really get why Patrick and Omri go back as inanimate objects in this book, but in the next book, Patrick goes back as himself. That didn't really make sense to me. But there's more to it than that, because I don't get why Omri would go back as the TP, because it's very clear that the TP is not from Little Bear's time. So why does having that transport him back to Little Bear's time? Omri, I think, does have a pair of moccasins with him. I forget if it's Little Bear's moccasins or Little Bear's wife's moccasins, but maybe that is the explanation for why he goes back to Little Bear's time, because he has these moccasins. But why would having those moccasins transport him back exactly to Little Bear's time, exactly at the time of this battle? Why wouldn't it transport him back to any random moment where those moccasins feature? Like if those moccasins belong to Little Bear's father, for instance, why wouldn't Omri go back to that time? Or if the moccasins were eventually owned by someone in 1970s who went to Vietnam to fight in the war, why wouldn't it transport him there? So it doesn't really make sense why this magical mumbo jumbo magically knows to transport him exactly where he wants to go, to Little Bear's time when he's fighting this battle. But again, it's deeper flawed than that. So in the book, when they give the Indians all these now guns, they give weapons from, I don't know, it doesn't say which war, like World War II or just plainly modern day, like the Gulf War or whatever. They give these Indians these modern guns and send them back to Little Bear's time. But if they have these guns from World War II, why wouldn't having those guns transport the Indians to World War II? Why would it transport them to Little Bear's time just because he's in the cupboard with them? If they are actually holding these guns, you should reason that they would go to whichever timeline those guns are from. In the same way, in the book, Omri has Little Bear's or Little Bear's wife's moccasins, so he goes back to that time. He has the moccasins, so he goes back to that time. So why do the Indians, when they have the now guns, why don't they go back to the now guns period, to the Gulf War or the Bosnia War or World War II or whatever? If they're holding the gun, they should go back to that time, just as Omri goes back to Little Bear's time because he has the moccasins. It doesn't make sense. Omri wants to go to this battle, though, with Little Bear, so the magical Mumbo Jumbo magically knows to transport him there, not to any other random time, such as whoever made the moccasins. Little Bear's father or his wife's father or whatever, or any point in her life, or any point where those moccasins feature, whether it's like if those moccasins were in a museum in 1930, why didn't Omri go to that museum and he's stuck to these pair of shoes? But no, he goes back to this battle where Little Bear is fighting, exactly where he wants to be. That is just, I know I am being way too complicated about this, but I think it's a plot hole. You have all these Indians linked up and they have these now guns, but they go back to Little Bear's time. Why? Why don't they go back to World War II or the Korean War or wherever these guns are from, which they are holding? And it's canonical in the book. If you are holding the object from whatever time, if you're holding Little Bear's moccasins, you go back to Little Bear's time. Presumably, if you're holding something of Boone's, the cowboy, you go back to his time. So why, if you're holding these guns, why wouldn't you go back to that time? Why would you go back to Little Bear? Why would you go back to Little Bear's period instead of any other Indian in the cupboard's period? It just made no sense. Now, I know some people would say, well, it's a children's story. It's kind of meant to be unrealistic. It's about these toys coming back to life. It's magical. But I think the magic has to make some kind of sense. And I could suspend disbelief in terms of the cupboard. And just this idea that you put these figures into this cupboard and you use this magical key and open it and the Indians or whatever toys are in there become alive. That's all well and good. I get that that's part of the story. But when you are trying to establish some kind of logical reason to it, it needs to make sense. So imagine if you have these Indians from all these different time periods holding guns from different wars, all holding hands together. Why do they all go exactly to the time and place that they want to go? Why don't they go to any random point for any other Indian or any of the guns? But they just go back precisely with Little Bear to the exact period that they want to go. And Omri and Patrick both do the same. They go exactly where they want to go, and they just magically know it'll work. They don't really question it too much. They just know it'll work because these guys are clearly geniuses. They know everything about time travel and how this magical cupboard and key works, even though they cause so many problems. But it works out exactly the way they wanted. Anyway, I know I am talking way too much about this and I'm probably boring everyone to death. No one's probably listening at this point. But this just bothered me. It drove me crazy because it just makes no sense and it's just logically flawed. And again, it's about a magical cupboard where toys come back to life. That's all well and good. That's part of the story. Suspend your disbelief. But I just can't really accept that they give these guns to all these Indians and they link hands or whatever it is they do and they all go back precisely with Little Bear. Why? Why is not explained. And that's a big deal because I think if you don't explain the why, it's just anything could happen. And I don't know. I just don't like it. And to me, that's where the book really began to fail. And that is why I say you should not get advice or story ideas from children. Because the children may have said, oh, just give them modern weapons or whatever. And so the author tries to find a way to make it work. But it doesn't really work if you think it through. That's why children are not good for giving ideas. They do not think everything through. So that is a problem with the book. So in the end, I did not read the whole book. I read about 80% of it, and then I just began skimming because the book just collapsed to me. All this plot about whatever, I just explained it, but that really lost my interest, so I just began skimming. So I did not read the whole book. Rating it, I think I would have to give it a very thin 3 stars and no more than that. I did have deep problems with the book, but it's nothing to give it just 1 or 2 stars. I think it does deserve to have a couple stars knocked off for just the plotting, just the plot holes, the inconsistencies of it. It just, I don't know. And in a way, this book pretty much killed the series for me, especially reading on the summaries of the next books and seeing, oh, here's Patrick causing problems and it's now Boone's time. And I don't know. As a whole, I think the book just begins to lose its way. So I would really just recommend reading the first book, Indian in the Cupboard. I did like that book. I did enjoy it. So that book is still a recommended read. If you enjoyed that book, you could still read this one if you want. Maybe you'd enjoy it. I don't know. I'm a pretty picky reader. Would I recommend it? No. Am I glad I read it? I guess, just to satisfy my curiosity. But it's not a book I would recommend. So I would just give it 3 stars. I do recommend the first book, and I also, again, I love the movie, so I would recommend both of those. Read the book and see the movie. Those are all both good. Okay, I don't usually do this, but I thought I would put a question to you guys. What is a book, especially a children's book, where you've read the book and seen the movie? And what did you think of them? Did you like the book more? Did you like the movie better? Is there a children's story that has not been adapted into a movie that you think would make a great movie? Anyway, that is it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!